Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Dave's Do-It-Yourself Guide to Renaissance Polyphony. This is a talk I've been wanting to give for a long time because it's a topic that I love and that fascinates me, and I hope it interests you too. What I want to do is explain to you some methods that will allow you to get into this vast treasure trove of music that most of us know very little about, and that all kinds of sounds the same to us. And the reason it sounds the same to us is because it consists almost entirely of liturgical music in Latin written for the Catholic Church. And if, like me, you're not Catholic and you don't know Latin and you don't care about Catholic liturgical music, but you love music, you want to know what's going on here because it is gorgeous. And the reason we have so much of this stuff is because back in the day, this was considered the only music worth writing down and worthy of being preserved because it formed part of a repertoire of sacred music that was performed. Popular music was popular music. It was whatever strolling minstrels played. It consisted of songs that people knew or little dance numbers. You know, we did a little talk about Terpsichore, one of the first big collections of dance music that was ever published in the early 1600s. But we're going way before then, because when we talk about Renaissance polyphony or Renaissance music, we really mean musically something very, very, very different from what the Renaissance was historically. I mean, historically, the Renaissance, which was, of course, followed by the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, and then, really took place in a very brief period of time and mostly in Italy, from about, say, 1450 to the 1520s or 30s. That was the Renaissance historically. And it getting ever more delimited by historical research that opens up the story of what was happening in local regions and different times. So, from a historical point of view, it doesn't mean very much to help us in terms of listening to music. From a musical point of view, on the other hand, what we're talking about is just about anything that's multi-voiced, that is polyphonic, written in one or, two or more parts to be sung simultaneously, from the 13th century all the way until Monteverdi, which is like, say, 1600, around there. So you're really talking about, you got to figure 350 years. That's just a huge chunk of time in terms of human progress, artistically speaking. We don't have a period of music that we consider routinely that's anything like that length. I mean, the Baroque period, well, that was pretty long. Say it went from 1600 to 1750, so it's 150 years. The Classical period, 1750 to 1830, so you've got maybe 80 years or so. And then the Romantic period, which overlaps a little, so it's 1820 to like 1900, 80 years, maybe again. And then it all breaks up into, impressionist and modernist and postmodern and demodern and unmodern and remodern. And, it all becomes just a hopeless jumble because we're too close to it. We see all the teeny little distinctions. And of course, when we look at the music from periods in the past, we don't see those same distinctions. People who lived back then would have seen them for sure, but we don't because A, we ignore 99.9% of what was really going on, and we only pick the things we like, and we pick those things on the basis of certain stylistic similarities that appeal to us, and so we create periods. That doesn't mean that they're real. I mean, what was really going on? Well, sometimes we're right, sometimes we're not, or we're right about a little teeny piece of it, but we characterize entire swaths of human history that way. So it is with the Renaissance, this 3 centuries or more of music, which has an enormous variety of styles and schools, but most of us, even music lovers, unless we really want to learn it, like learning a language, like paying attention to its syntax and its structure and its forms and its conventions, we don't hear a lot of those differences, but they're there. And the more you know it, the more variety you detect. It's like anything else. The more you know something, the more you understand it. I mean, that's not rocket science, folks, right? But I want to sort of give you an entree into this world because it's as rich and splendid a musical universe as any that we've had. And it's only a question of how do you get to know it? Where do you get into it? And what should you listen for? And I want to make a few suggestions that may help you on that journey. That's the goal of this little talk. Now, as I said, almost all of this music is Latin liturgical music, which is in itself an issue. The large form, that is the equivalent of the symphony as opposed to the smaller form, the song or whatever, is the Mass, right? The basic Mass, which has 4 or 5 parts, depending on whether you include a Kyrie. One part may or may not be included, but it has 5 basic parts. The Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus/Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei Dona Nobis Pacem. Those are your parts of a Mass. And you're going to be listening to millions of Mass settings. And if you don't care about the words, as I don't, and you just want to enjoy the music, which I do, then you don't need to worry about what they're singing about too much, other than certain special moments, such as the Crucifixus in the middle of the Credo, which is always a moment of great solemnity, or the Sanctus, a moment of great spiritual significance. You begin to get a sense for these special moments, and you should know what the words are. Not that you have to pay attention to them so much as they're being sung, but you should know what they are, and that's easy to do. You can find them anywhere. It's not a big deal. But the essence of a lot of this music, and we're going to go through quite a bit of it, is what we call the cantus firmus technique. I love the cantus firmus. What does that mean? It means you base a piece of music on something pre-existing. It could be a bit of plain chant, that is Gregorian chant, or it could be a popular song, or it could be another piece of sacred music. In some way, you use this as the basis of the structure of the multi-voice, the polyphonic edifice that you're going to erect on the new liturgical text that you're using. And there are many, many, many ways to do it. And because this was the way this stuff was written, this is the secret key that you can use to just find your way around. After you sort of know who the players are and what they did, then you can pick the ones you like the best and you move along, whatever pace suits you. But you have to start somewhere. So where I started, and this is what worked for me, was I took a tune. Called L'Homme Armé, the Armed Man. The Armed Man is a fascinating tune, and I'm going to get to it in 1 minute. Just before we go into that in more depth, I just want to show you, I want you to hear for yourself just how varied this music really is. I'm going to play you 2 little excerpts, and they're all for the same voices, that is, unaccompanied voices singing the same text in a Mass. First, Guillaume de Machaut's Notre Dame Mass, the Messe de Notre Dame. Now, Machaut lived from 1300 to the 1370s. So this is way, way back. And his is the first polyphonic setting of the Mass text that we have, that has survived. There may have been others, but this is the one. And so have a listen just to the opening, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. It's the only 2 words they're singing. Here you go. Doesn't that sound kind of primal? The harmony is still like fairly primitive by our ears, to modern ears, by our standards. It's really quite fascinating. But then we're going to jump ahead, and we're going to jump ahead quite a bit. We're going to jump ahead to William Byrd, who lived from 1540 to 1623. So we're talking about 300 years later. And he wrote 3 masses in Latin, one for 3 voices, one for 4 voices, and one for 5 voices in 5 parts. Here is the Kyrie of his mass in 5 voices. Totally different, isn't it? I mean, that's the only point I want to make. That the two, it's the same forces, it's the same text, but the musical styles are completely different. So yes, things changed over 300 years. They changed more slowly. There are a lot of reasons for that. The most important reason is because the pace of change in the world of liturgical music tends to be slower than it is in the rest of the universe, because the music has to first and foremost serve the traditional liturgical purpose for which it was intended, and the church fathers were understandably unwilling to encourage wild experimentation in the world of avant-garde musical practice. They wanted music that did the same thing week after week because it was set to the same text, and that text was eternal, and the message was eternal, and the music had to be eternal. So that doesn't exactly argue for rapid change and development, and yet that change and development happened, and you're going to hear that too. So let me get back to what I was talking about now that we've done that. I was talking about a song, L'Homme Armé. This was the greatest hit of the 15th century. Everybody was singing it. You may have even heard the tune. It goes, L'Homme, l'Homme, l'Homme Armé, L'Homme Armé, da 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 da. It's a very popular tune. I'm going to play it for you. Here it is, L'Homme Armé.
L'homme, l'homme, l'homme armé, l'homme armé, l'homme armé doit condoubler, doit condoubler. Pour la paix, bateau créé, que chacun se vienne donner de l'argent de fer. L'homme, l'homme, l'homme armé, l'homme armé, l'homme armé doit condoubler.
Okay, so maybe you've heard that, maybe you haven't. Here's the point. You take this tune and you build a mass on top of it. This tune was so popular that just about every composer worth his salt for the next 2 centuries did a mass based on this tune. And there are about 40 of them that we know of, and there probably were many more, but 40 or so of them have survived. I'm going to talk about at least 10. And this, for me, was sort of the way I got into this, because you can take a whole bunch of composers covering a period of about 200 years, all of whom wrote masses based on the same thing. And what's wonderful about it isn't that they all sound the same. What's wonderful about it is they don't sound the same at all. In fact, you really won't even hear the tune most of the time. But this was a great hook on which to get to know the most famous names of this era. And so I'm going to tell you who they were. But that initial tune we heard was L'Homme Armé. And that was only one version of it, of course, because in those days, nothing got written down unless it was really important. And you could sing things in many, many, many different ways. Here is the same tune, L'Homme Armé, only in this case, it's in mode 7. Listen to this.
L'homme, l'homme, l'homme armé, l'homme armé, l'homme armé doit condoubler, on le fait partout crier, que chacun se vienne armé de nobles dons de fer.
Rather different, wasn't it? Because the original was in a minor sounding tonality to us, and mode 7 is a major sounding tonality to us, more or less. The difference between the modes of those days and keys in our day is that we only have two modes. We have major and minor. That's it. Those are our modes. But back in the day, there were 7 of them. And you may have heard of them. You know, it was the Ionian, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the Ionian, the Locrian. Those are the 7 modes. And all that means is a scale based on one of the white notes of the piano with no black notes, except for B flat, which is a whole other issue. But if you just do a scale from note to note in an octave, you'll get a mode. And each of those modes has a different pattern of half steps and whole steps. And so they mix major and minor tonalities rather freely. And if you write a piece of music based on one of these modes, all the chords will be based on that pattern of half steps and whole steps, that mixture of major and minor. And a lot of early music uses this modal harmony. When we hear it, we think of older music, we think of timeless music, and it's also emotionally often quite ambivalent because it's neither major nor minor. It's a little bit of both. And we're used to hearing and associating our two modes with very, very specific emotional qualities. That was not the case in this period, so banish it from your mind. You've heard 2 versions now of L'Homme Armé, the actual song on which these masses are built. Now, the next question is this: how do you build a mass on a popular tune? There's a zillion ways to do it. Basically, you take the tune or some bit of the tune, as much of it as you want, and you can use it as what they call a cantus firmus, which means in one of the parts, and these masses can have anywhere from 3 to 6 or 7 or 8 parts, you have them sing the tune, often in very, very long notes. So you don't hear the tune. Most of the time you won't hear the tune. You can use it if you want. You can stick it in a part somewhere, but because the music is contrapuntal, there's so much going on simultaneously, the chances that you actually detect the tune are not very high. That's just the reality. And that's a good thing, because if all you heard was the same tune over and over again, you would go mad from boredom. It's just a construction principle. That's all it is. It's a way to get yourself moving on the musical path that you're setting foot on. And once you're going, you can do anything you want. You can let your fantasy run wild with the way that you elaborate the basic tune that you've chosen. So we have now 10 settings of the Mass, all of which are based on this same tune. And let's compare certain bits of each. I have 3 examples now that I'm going to compare for you while we run through the names of all these people. And this is the Gloria setting of the Mass that is going to serve as our musical example, so you hear the difference. The first is Guillaume Dufay. Now Dufay, I'm going to take this out here so that I can hold it up a little better without the glare. Dufay was, one of the great illustrious names of the 15th century. He lived from around 1400 to 1474. Here is the Gloria of his Mass based on L'Homme Armé. Okay, that's just the first bit of it. Very, very pretty, isn't it? It's extremely attractive. And that was sort of the famous setting from probably the first half of the 15th century. But later on in the 15th century, we get a whole slew of composers that we care about a lot, who are major, major, major guys, including Josquin des Prés. Now, Josquin he's one of the great names in the history of music. I mean, everybody agrees with that. He was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And he wrote 2 masses based on L'Homme Armé. And in this one, the one that we're going to hear, he uses the 6th mode, which is the Aeolian mode, the mode based on the note A. And here is L'Homme Armé played in sung, in mode 6. Now, here is Josquin's Gloria, based on that tune in mode 6. I left that up there for a little while because it's so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. You don't want it to stop. I mean, Josquin's music is like that. It is unbelievably gorgeous. And I think you could hear it was more elaborate. It moved more than Dufay's did, at least in this performance. There'll be different performances, different tempos. It's like any other kind of music. The performance makes a huge amount of difference. Because these composers left no performance indications other than, simple setting of the text. All the dynamics, all of the phrasing, all of that stuff has to be added by modern performers. So you can hear very, very, very different interpretations of this music. But you can tell that did not sound like Dufay, I don't think. And the more you listen to it, the less like Dufay it's going to sound, and the more each composer sounds like themselves. Now, staying in the 15th century or so, or that area, we also get, and leading into the 16th century, Desprez died in 1521. You get Ockeghem. He was one of the great composers from what these days is now called the Netherlands. And there were a whole bunch of them. There was a whole school of composers from the Netherlands, and they were extraordinary. Ockeghem was legendary in his day as a master of counterpoint. He wrote a mass called the Missa Prolationem, which is one of the great contrapuntal masterpieces in the history of Western music. But he also did a mass based on L'Homme Armé, which is quite beautiful and lovely. Similarly, this is Ockeghem again, but he had a colleague, Jacob Obrecht, who also did a L'Homme Armé mass. His name is Obrecht. You'll see it down below. I'll write it down for you. As with all these, then there was the French guy here, Antoine Busnois. Look at that. He did a L'Homme Armé mass. And then there's Pierre de la Rue. Here he is. Pierre de la Rue also did a L'Homme Armé mass. And as we're sort of moving up from 1450 to 1515, these are all 15th century, second half of the 15th century composers, post-Dufay but just one generation removed. Matthaeus Pipelare, there's a household name for you. There's a lot of glare on this one too here. Look at it, there you go. Pipelare, he did a L'Homme Armé Mass, which was quite lovely. And in Spain, we had there was one really famous Spanish composer of this period, Thomas Luis de Victoria, who you may have heard of because he's often referred to as sort of a contemporary and competitor in some ways of Palestrina. But Cristobal Morales also did a L'Homme Armé Mass. And one of the things I have to add too is that a lot of these recordings, these masses, they try and put them in liturgical context, and they do them with plain chant or other small sacred works, motets and things, so you get more of the religious experience. I tend to not like that because I'm not into the religious experience. I just want to hear the music of the Mass that they wrote. And the chant stuff, I usually skip, but you may feel differently about it than I do. I like hearing other sacred works. I mean, smaller sacred works, motets and other pieces, they're glorious and just as beautiful. They follow the same principles, only usually on a slightly smaller scale. But finally, the last composer we're going to talk about, number 10, is the man himself, the ultimate Palestrina. Believe it or not, Palestrina wrote like 100 and some odd Mass settings, so there had to be a L'Homme Armé Mass in there somewhere, right? And he did indeed do one. But the interesting thing about Palestrina, as I pick this thing up, is that he lived from 1525 roughly to 1594, which is a whole 16th century. And he really needs to be regarded as the end. We tend to think of Palestrina as like, the beginning of Western music as we know it, or the iconic Renaissance music composer. He wasn't. He wasn't at all. He was the end of an era, because by 1594, when Palestrina died, the first operas were being composed. And only a few years later, Monteverdi was going to write Orfeo, and Italian madrigals were going like crazy. It was a totally different world was happening, and Baroque music was starting to happen. The continuo was starting to happen, and harmony, more importantly, was beginning to be codified in terms of two modes, major and minor. And the most fascinating thing about Palestrina's setting of the Missa L'Homme Armé and his Gloria is that you can actually hear the tune. Palestrina was known for his clarity, his limpid contrapuntal clarity, which a lot of people mistake for dullness. It's not. There's an enormous technique and subtlety involved in Palestrina's music, and we're going to have a talk about him doing some other things not too soon from now, I hope. But if you want to really hear a L'Homme Armé Mass where you can hear the tune come and go once in a while, Palestrina's is the one to go for. Here, listen to his setting of the Gloria, and listen to dum bum ba da 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 da. Just listen for that. See? You actually heard a bit of it, didn't you? And this is a Mass. It's only for 4 voices, so it's not as complex as some of the other settings we've heard. But the point is, by the time we get to Palestrina, we've covered 200 years of music and 200 years of Mass settings using this simple text, L'Homme Armé. So if you're starting a collection of Renaissance polyphony, if we call it that, of this style of music, this, I think, is just a great way to get yourself started, because you'll be familiar with the tune, you'll have an entree, and you'll get to know all of these composers, the major players. Get 1 disc of each, and then just pick someone who you like and go with it, run with it, find your own way. and start listening to some of the things they did. One thing leads to another. It's inevitable because they're all setting texts that are shared between them, and sometimes based on music that's shared between them. And so one thing leads to another. It's a treasure hunt. That's really what it is. And happily, a lot of this music is available on Naxos, so I can play these sound clips for you. But I hope that this little taste, just a little taste of this music and the variety and range of it, and this description of sort of what it is and kind of how it works, has piqued your curiosity and given you a reason to start listening to these pieces, because you'll find that it will simply insert itself so naturally into your life. You'll know when you're in the mood for it and when you want to hear something else, but there's a place for it. There's a place for it in your life. I guarantee it. And so all you need to do is keep on listening. Thank you so much and enjoy.